My name is Simon Zadek. I'm the co-director of the UNEP Inquiry, the sister initiative, in effect, to the UNEP Finance Initiative. I think you've probably heard a little bit about the work already over the last day or so. And I'm going to moderate this session on financial technology and sustainable finance. We've got an absolutely great panel to take us through what, for some of you, will be a well-understood topic. Those of you who know a little bit about fintech, just put your hands up. Okay, so that's about 20%. Those of you who think you know quite a lot about fintech, put your hands up. Don't be shy. I've only got one. Okay, it's almost pointless then to ask the question, is that you, Nick? Jeez. All right, that was a cheat. Okay, and so I'm assuming if I asked anyone who thinks they're a real expert in fintech to stand up, panel excluded, you'd all stay sitting down? Is that roughly right? Great. Okay, well, we're going to have a good time. So I'm going to ask in a minute, in fact, the panel members to start off, not in any way patronizing you, but just giving a brief description of what we mean or what they mean by fintech. And then in the second round, I'm going to go into the connections between fintech and sustainable finance. Just before I do that, I just wanted to make the link back to the UNEP Inquiry work. So as some of you will know, the UNEP Inquiry started at the beginning of 2014. We did a whole bunch of analysis of what kind of policy and regulatory and financial innovations were going on in this space and published our first major report at the IMF annual meetings last year that were in Peru. We then discovered that we got it all wrong. We then discovered that actually we got the whole thing wrong, and we haven't told the senior management team of UNEP this. I can see Ligia sitting over there. Hopefully she's not listening. And we got it wrong for one simple reason, which was we were looking at sustainable finance principally in relation to today's existing financial system. Yeah, that we were looking at the way banks operate today and the way institutional investors operate today and the way insurance functions today. And although, of course, that's not wrong, as we've seen over the past day, it's probably going to be increasingly wrong in the future. And so we embarked on a second round of work that was saying, okay, well, a lot of the assumptions that we've made about, what a bank may look like in 5 years may turn out to be just off the wall. And many of the institutions that we're trying to work out how to engage in this agenda are going through profound changes themselves that don't directly have much at all to do with sustainable finance, but have to do with the way in which the sector is being disrupted in multiple ways, including the way in which new technology within the sector is changing the underlying nature of business models in multiple forms. And so we started working over the past 8 months much more on the question, given some of those changes, how can we understand sustainable finance? And what sort of leadership do we need to look for? And where might that leadership come from? And I think we have on the stage not only some folks that know a lot about the subject, but our leaders themselves in this area. So I think that's particularly exciting. So for us at UNEP, the challenge is not just, oh, and there's this subject called fintech as well. Does that help us a bit? But how is fintech going to change a lot of the answers that we thought we'd understood already in the way in which to advance sustainable finance, in Rachel's terms, in Eric's terms, at scale over the short to medium term. So that, if you like, is the agenda for this session, and hopefully you'll find it interesting. So I'm going to start off not by introducing my three panelists. I'm sure you've got the bios, Santao, Gus, and Sam, from, in broad terms, from an experience within China, looking more at the MENA region, although I think also internationally, Gus, and looking particularly at the experience of Kenya. So welcome to all three of you. And I'm going to just ask, and perhaps, Santao, I'll start with you, perhaps just sort of a 60 to 90 second, what on earth are we talking about here when we're talking about fintech?
I think fintech is a new word, but it should not be exaggerated to say fintech is disrupting the traditional financial system. I think it's competition and cooperation. Competition means fintech may have a different business model. Cooperation means we have different target of customer or clients. So it could be a medium-term cooperation. And eventually, there will be a convergence of the traditional financial institution and the new financial institution like fintech. It will be a step-by-step approach along with the new paradigm for financial regulation. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Gus, your 60 to 90 second educational moment.
Starts now with no repetition, hesitation, or, okay.
Absolutely.
Thank you, hello, good morning. I agree with Santao. I think fintech has the potential to be a very powerful disruptor with profound implications for the financial sector. In a similar way, perhaps to Big Bang in the UK, the Millennium Bug, and perhaps the introduction of the internet as well that we've seen over the last 20 to 30 years. I think when it's coupled with the agenda around sustainability, it forces, as Simon has said, a complete rethink of the business model in many cases, but also a range of whole new opportunities for companies as well as government. I'd like to offer a definition of fintech based on 4 different areas of fintech as a contribution to the discussion that may be useful going forward. One is around payments. There's obviously vast changes happening from a payments point of view in the financial services industry. Secondly, around data and analytics, the driving more transactions through a technology system allows you to capture, track, analyze a lot more information about everything that's happening. And that has profound implications as well about learning what works and what doesn't and creating new opportunities. The third one is around the financial software that springs up on the back of all of this. And we've seen some great innovations that have happened so far. Both in terms of risk management, but also in terms of payments and banking. And then finally, platforms. So again, using IT in a way to broaden the reach of the financial sector to the masses. Things like peer-to-peer lending are made much easier. The transaction size can be much smaller. So all of these 4 areas, I think, are perhaps a useful way to look at fintech as an area as a whole and begin to understand individually what is happening in each of those areas and what the implications could be for the industry going forward.
Okay, that's absolutely fantastic. We're very lucky we haven't heard anything about cryptocurrencies yet, where it all gets more complicated. Let me pass over, Sam, to you, just to sort of 1.5 minute kind of how would you explain fintech through your experience lens?
Yeah, thanks. I come from KCB, which is East Africa's largest bank. We started in Kenya, but we're in the entire East African region, all the countries that are the East African region. And I need to give perspective as to what fintech is able to do. For a long time, our bank is over 100 years in the region, actually 120 years this year. And we did all the traditional banking, the opening of the accounts, giving the loans, what is traditionally known as banking. But about 3 years ago, we ventured a lot more in things like mobile and non-branch channels in a very aggressive way. We've been in the area of mobile and maybe other channels, maybe more aggressively over the last 5 years. But perspective of what fintech is able to do is that maybe up to 3 years ago, we'd opened, say, 3 million accounts for the 117 years. But in the last 3 years alone, and maybe even strictly in the last 1.5 years ago, we've been able to scale that up to about 12 million. And this is just the power of technology. Ability to scale rapidly in a way that you were not able to do previously. So that, the exponential potential of using technology, and if we look at our transactions today, over the last 5 years, today we are having 78% of our transactions are non-branch transactions. We have the largest network of branches in the region, 250 and growing, but 78% of our transactions are now going through non-branch channels. Largely mobile, maybe 60+% in mobile, And then, of course, point of sale, agents, and various other ways, and of course, the internet banking. So it shows fundamentally that there's a huge, huge shift. If you look at something like the loan product, just a final example, most of our loans today are actually through, in number, that is, they are coming through the mobile. And over the last 1.5 years, using KCB M-Pesa, which is one of our major retail products, we've loaned $120 million over 1.5 years just through mobile. There is no collateral, it's just using data. He mentioned data earlier, using data analytics, seeing behavior, and being able to lend purely through mobile. And it's performed very, very well. So I think fundamentally, for me, coming out of the definition is to give the impact, the potential, and the things it's able to do. And we're able to scale up that to many other things, but that's just a flavor of the power of fintech.
And I'm just going to stick on this for 2 seconds and ask you each one other brief question, which is, how disruptive in your minds will fintech be to this lot? You know, to the let's call it the traditional financial community in its various forms. Sam?
I think for me, in a region like Africa, I think first of all it's inevitable. I think somebody says that truth is first resisted and then eventually considered to be self-evident. I think if you look at the power of mobile, for instance, compared to a branch, it's almost inevitable that people will have to go to alternative ways of delivery. Like, for instance, since I came here for the last 2 days, I've not put on my telly even once, but I've been following all the news. I know what's happening. I know what Donald Trump said this morning. I mean, you're able to cover everything without putting on your telly at all. The disruption is that significant. It's going to become inevitable that the branch is going to be what everyone is holding. That's what's happening in a place like Kenya, but I think it's going to become inevitable, maybe throughout the world.
Brilliant. Gus, briefly?
I echo that. I would also add that, I mean, it offers the opportunity for costs to come down substantially, for some of the old ways of working really to be challenged. I think it presents a lot of new opportunities, and it's the early movers, the early adopters that embrace that will benefit most from it. And I think certainly in a region like MENA, where there is huge ambition to achieve great outcomes, targets are being set almost on a monthly basis. It's a fantastic enabler to support that. The money is there. We need the fintech to remove some of the fog that exists and the mystery that exists at the moment, and allow some of these things to move forward at a greater speed.
In China, how disruptive?
I don't think fintech will disrupt the traditional financial institution, because we have an 80-20 rule. In China, we have a large amount of financial services provided to only 20% of the major players of the economy, like state-owned enterprises. And another 80% of population, which is underserved or unserved by the traditional financial system. So the fintech is providing financial services to the second part, 80%, SME and individuals. So it's a complementary story.
Brilliant. Okay, so hopefully, you know, for those of you who knew very little, you know a bit more, and we have a sort of a sufficient table to begin the conversation actually that we've come here to address. Sam, I'm going to start with you, and then perhaps come over to you, Santao, come to you, Gus, last. You know, help us understand the scope of possibilities that fintech brings to accelerating sustainable finance, perhaps drawing on the case of Kenya.
Okay, I think, first of all, one of the important things about fintech is inclusion, because it's been very difficult to use the traditional brick and mortar to go to the final frontier, particularly in a country like Kenya, where infrastructure may not be as good as in Dubai. And so, in a sense, by using fintech, you're able to leapfrog certain other constraints. I think one of the reasons mobile has really grown in East Africa and in Africa at large was because it was very, very difficult, for instance, to get landline infrastructure working very, very well. There were only about 300,000 lines. Suddenly, when you bring mobile technology and you make it's very cost effective, you can have 25, 30 million people, today, for instance, just on mobile money, we have about 25 million Kenyans. In other words, part of it is the inclusion debate. And in any case, even when you look at the SDG, part of it is simply about inclusion. People able to access, people able to participate. So that's where it's important, just as a starting point, and creating an infrastructure that's cost effective and that's available. But one of the things that we are seeing in Kenya is that this has mainly touched retail. I mean, I said about transactions, numbers, volumes, fintech is doing very, very well there. But when it comes to huge transactions, I mean, the corporate bank, the bulk, that continues to be dealt with fairly traditional. So what we're doing is that we are removing a lot of the just basic transactions out of the banking halls and leaving only significant transactions that need face-to-face contact and documentation and things like that. But where fintech is becoming relevant, even things like the green economy, is that, and our central bank governor was here yesterday, he talked about the green bond. What we are working at the moment on is to be able to have everyone, these people participating in the green bond through mobile. Right. So when we do that, that's what's going to happen for the first green bond. So suddenly you're able to bring all these resources, almost crowdfund sort of, in terms of getting everybody into participating. So that ability for retail at a low level to access up to $10, $100 etc. is a very, very important part of bringing everybody into sustainable finance.
And so you've got the basic infrastructure,
yes.
to your point, and also the governor's point yesterday,
yes.
and then a whole range of possible product innovations and services that build on top of it, including sort of citizen access to investing savings in green bonds.
Yes.
Would be an example.
Yes.
Great, fantastic. Santal, let me come over to you, perhaps particularly because Eric mentioned, and you could give just a sort of a minute of the sort of, I don't know, quantitative characterization of AND, and then perhaps talk a little bit to the same question, which is, how does what you're doing have anything to do with the green inclusive finance agenda?
Sure, thank you. Maybe many people don't know Ant Financial, but I'm sure 99% of you know Alibaba. Right? So Ant Financial is a related company of Alibaba working on financial services. In Ant Financial, we have different businesses. One of them is called Alipay. I don't know if anyone you have used that before. It's basically a payment service. Besides Alipay, we have insurance, we have banking, we have credit, we have wealth management, we have big data. So we have different businesses in Ant Financial. To give a picture of what does Ant Financial look like, I give you a couple of numbers. The user of Ant Financial account in China is 450 million individuals. There is a money market fund called Yuebao. The user is 300 million. The asset managed by this money market fund ranked #1 in China, #2 in the world. And another number you may be interested in, this April, we have a second round of funding. The evaluation of Ant Financial is $60 billion US, which is the largest unicorn in the world. And the final number to give you, risk management is the key for any financial institution. The fraud rate in Ant Financial is 1 in 100,000. I give you a competitor's rate, fraud rate is 1 in 1,000. We are 1 in 100,000. So you can see our risk management approach. So this is a very quick introduction of Ant Financial. Basically, you just understand as a financial service provider related to Alibaba. This is the first part. The second part, I give you a quick summary of what our business model are, what our uniqueness could be. We have 3 pillars in Ant Financial. How to promote financial inclusion and how to promote green finance. We have 3 pillars. One is so-called regulatory compliance. That means you have to follow the regulation. You have to follow the rule in the market. Not only the regulation in China, but also regulation by Basel. Right? This is a regulatory compliance. The second one is technology-driven, which refers to internet, mobile phone, cloud computing, artificial intelligence. So all these technology are helping Ant Financial to provide online service rather than offline service like traditional bank, traditional financial institution are doing. The second one, technology-driven. The third one is user case or scenario-based. I can give you an example. You know, we have Alibaba in China. Next month, we will have another so-called November 11 sales, like a Black Friday in the US. On that day, all of the Chinese most of the sellers will go to the Alibaba website to sell their goods. And the buyers, especially women in China, will go to the website to buy the goods, which is cheaper, huge amount of reduction. So in this process, Ant Financial or specific Alipay will provide financial transaction support to each transaction. Last year, in last November 11, the peak of the transaction per second was 86,000 transactions per second. 86,000 per second. That means if you want to buy something, 86,000 transactions can be done per second. International competitor is 14,000 per second.
Okay, so we got the scale, you got the speed.
Okay.
You've all got that. Now, so that's brilliant, absolutely brilliant. So the financial inclusion bit, I think one sees very clearly from Kenya. Help us perhaps understand what some of your other thinking is on where you're taking this platform.
Yeah. Let's link to the question about the fintech and sustainable development. I think fintech can help sustainable development, green finance, in three ways. One is reachable. Second is affordable. Third one is sustainable. Reachable means you have mobile phone, you have internet. You can reach those population who cannot reach before, like in China, Tibet, Xinjiang. You cannot reach before using traditional financial service. Now you can use internet, mobile phone. Second, affordable. You have to be sufficient enough to reduce the cost. How can we do that? We use big data. We use cloud computing to reduce the potential costs related to the transaction coming from scale economy. The third one is sustainable. You have to make it commercial viable in a medium-term way. So we use a scenario, we use technology, we use regulatory compliance to reach the three targets. So in this way, we can take advantage of the link of fintech to green, sustainable development. My final point is related to Eric. Just now, he mentioned the Ant Forest. It's a kind of scheme, our product trying to encourage individuals to reduce their carbon emission. Traditionally, many enterprises, banks, use a large amount of money try to help carbon reduction in enterprises. This is one approach we are taking as well, but it's small. But another most important new innovation we have, because we have 450 million users. So everybody, if they try to pay their bill online instead of using their paper, if they do not go to the bank to do business, they just do online. If they travel on bicycle, they travel in subway, we can save a lot of potential carbon emission. I can give you a number. Last year, 2015, the total amount of carbon emission is calculated as 6 million trees to be saved. That means all the transactions we provided, we saved 6 million trees, which is about half of the forest in northeast China, Daxian Anling. That means 2 years, we can produce another 大型案例。
Fantastic, fantastic. And just to sort of pick out one piece, and Gus, and then I'll come to you. Clearly, all of the inclusive piece and cost piece, I'm sure, kind of comes naturally to all of our thinking. We can kind of understand that and see how that can go to scale. UNEP has just forged a partnership with Ant, as Eric Solheim mentioned, and one of the particular areas that we are fascinated in is the potential of translating large-scale financial transaction data into carbon data, and beginning in effect to create, without policies and regulations, an individual-based carbon market using large-scale financial transaction data. And that, for us, kind of opens a completely new avenue that neither we nor others have really thought about before. Gus, let me come to you. You know, you work for EY, so you cover a lot of territory. You see many different companies and what they're doing. Perhaps jumping sort of beyond the kind of the inclusive, affordable piece that's already been covered by Sam and Santao. How do you see the critical links between fintech and sustainable finance?
Thank you. I'm very impressed by what's happening in China, and it's great to hear these stories because that's how things change around the world. We need examples of where it's worked and real data to back it up. And certainly the finance community individuals that I've interacted with in the past, they tend to be a fairly skeptical lot. They want the empirical evidence, they want to know it works, they want to know how it impacts their return at the end of the day. And I think the opportunity for fintech to play a large role in addressing a number of areas perhaps that have been challenges in the past should not be overlooked either. Things like increasing access for small and medium enterprises perhaps to the world stage that they couldn't access before is a large part of that. Increasing economic productivity. I mean, if I can do all of my transactions electronically, save paper, etc., it's all done. I have 5 minutes, I can suddenly take care of everything. There's huge potentials there. I think for the bigger transactions, that's the big prize. I mean, we can do a lot of small things and all of our individual accounts can be handled online, but it's the big investments where really the change needs to happen now. And I feel, having looked at this sector for a number of years, there's still a lot of resistance there. They're comfortable with a traditional approach. They're skeptical of new things coming along because it's always worked this way in the past. And yet, you know, by moving on and looking more closely at how to harness this technology, both because sometimes your customers and your clients want it, and they're already embracing technology in other aspects of their business. It's just the financial community sometimes that's lagging for these things. There are some considerations, I think, that need to be taken into account as we look to embrace this more fully, which some of it are the obvious ones around data security, and we've seen some high-profile cases over the last couple of years where data's been hacked and people are nervous about entrusting everything to a technology system. There's the opportunity for misuse of that data once everything is captured online as well. But again, there's ways to address this, and there are, you know, tools and processes and approaches that can be employed to make sure that the risks of those things happening are minimized. There's obviously consequences around embezzlement and misuse of funds and that sort of thing, but that's no different from the real world. So we need to take an approach that looks to address those fully and in a way that reassures investors as well as business users. There's a challenge around diverse standards and perhaps a lack of interoperability that we might be facing in future. As fintech continues to explode, there is the challenge that we end up with lots of different standards and different approaches. And that would be a shame because it would minimize the progress and the impact that the financial sector could have going forward. And then finally, I guess there's an issue for me which is interesting as a consultancy, which is around the governance and how do we manage it and oversee it. What's happening in China is fantastic, but we might have something completely different popping up somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else. And if we end up with too many standards and there isn't a governance and perhaps some guidance in terms of how it should be rolled out and used, perhaps principles of some sort, like the Equator Principles, etc., we run the risk of perhaps undershooting what could be achieved with this whole area.
Gus, that's very helpful. And actually, you sort of jumped into a next question I was going to ask you, so that saves me the breath, which is to begin to sort of tease out beyond the sort of technological upsides what some of the challenges also are. I wanted to, although I still can't really see people terribly well, I wanted to kind of turn to you and perhaps ask for any questions or comments. In the various sessions I've run over the last few months on fintech, more than any other subject in this space, I have noticed an extraordinary generational difference in the way in which the conversation is run. Broadly speaking, not wanting to comment on the age profile of people in the room, the middle and later generational ages tend to look at this from an efficiency and effectiveness point of view, so business process, whereas millennials have tended to much more quickly comment on how this could change individual behavior through shifting social identity through virtual means, through social media platforms. So, whatever age you are, I'd like you just to kind of remember that there is a sort of big institution aspect to fintech, how it changes the nature of business processes, but don't ignore or belittle the way in which it's driving towards a society where generations are using online identity and interactions as significant drivers of their long-term behavior. So with that, I'd like to open it up. I'm assuming there's a gentleman here on my left. Perhaps you could just sort of say who you are and chuck out the question or comment.
Sure. Mustafa Aram here, Dunya Finance. Thank you very much. It's a very informative panel. My question is to all of you, actually. For fintech to be disruptive, truly disruptive and sustainable, one will argue that the scale has to be achieved and to make it effective. Do you feel that the regulatory landscape around the world is moving at the right pace and maturity to support that growth in scale and enable fintech players to achieve that scale in a reasonable period of time? We've heard, obviously, some good examples from Africa. M-Pesa has been around for more than 10 years, and it's been hugely successful in reaching scale. Alibaba Pay has been very successful in reaching scale. But those who don't reach that scale will suffer, and some are obviously obstructed by the regulation. And we heard about the issues that Bitcoin is facing, other players are facing. So what do you think about the regulatory landscape? Is it moving at the same speed, or is it still lagging behind? Thank you.
That's great. We've got another question I can see lurking in the back there. Somebody with a beard. I guess that's probably a man.
Yes, it is.
Just stand up and give your name.
Hi, Elisha Schwa with Climate Action Network International. My question relates to the aspects of the governance side. Well, comment and question. On the comment side, when you mentioned the different kind of uniform approaches, if you look at some of the software platforms that we've had, like the iPhone and the Android, you have two different platforms and people are still very happy with it. So essentially it's just getting platforms at scale and then you will have a natural segmentation. But how to get to that scale and standards, if you look at the industrial side, you have like the Industrial Internet Consortium, where you have like very large providers of platforms for service, who have gotten together to sort of demonstrate and show how these things can scale up very fast. I was wondering if this is happening in the fintech sector, and if it's not, why? Because that would be a very useful tool to help things scale at scale.
Okay, thanks very much, Ellie. That's absolutely great. Apologies about the comment on the beard. Anybody else with a comment on this round? Yes, over there on my left.
Hugh Whelan from Responsible Investor. A quick question from the gentleman from Ant Financial. Have you looked at the difference in cost between what citizens in China are paying for financial services and outside of China, and the sustainability angle that you have put on Ant Forest? Why do you do that? What is the driver? Is that a clear business rationale for people to want to have that as an add-on to saving? Does it generate extra business or not? What's it all about?
Very good question indeed. You're not putting your hand up? I thought for a second you might be. Any other? Yes. There are two more that I'll take. Lady there and this gentleman over here. Just hold on a second. Please.
Hello, thank you very much for sharing your experiences.
Could you just introduce yourself first?
Sorry, yes, Nikki Kemp, sorry. Thank you very much for sharing your experiences. I find fintech very fascinating in its convergence with sustainable development finance, and in particular the problem statement that's been shared for the last day and a half around the no lack of projects, no lack of liquidity. So why aren't we seeing a rapid increase in financing of these projects coming to market? Blockchain is a potential way to connect individuals, citizens, if we refer to the terminology that was used in the last session, and some of these opportunities. I'm interested in your views on how you think blockchain can bring citizens and their willingness to invest in sustainable development in, I guess, a disintermediated way if the banks aren't willing to do so because of whatever reasons, regulatory or lack of leadership or whatever it is. So what role does blockchain play in closing that gap?
And just hold the mic for a second. I feel you have a lurking opinion. Just tell us what you think, and then I will ask them, don't worry, but tell us what you think.
I actually have only recently understood blockchain, so I don't know. I'm a real fan of blockchain because I think it's going to open up the flows of capital in a way that we've never seen before. I think there are big regulatory issues, compliance issues around money laundering and other difficult issues, but I don't think they're insurmountable because of the nature of blockchain and its very unique transaction safety nets around the process. So, as I say, I don't know enough about it to really have a strong opinion, other than I think it's probably going to open up very big opportunities. But my focus is, of course, on the sustainable development finance opportunities, if we could hear from the panel on that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Sorry to put you on the spot. I'm going to take one more from over here, sir.
Yes, Robert Charnock from the London School of Economics. Just a quick question. We've heard a lot about how fintech can help save on sort of paper use and the energy usage from traditional modes of banking. Could you comment on the relationship between fintech and the energy consumption of server farms as well?
Is there a lurking dark story on energy? Right, absolutely. Fintech and energy. Okay, I'll come for another round in a second, but why don't we just pick up on some of these points. There were a number of questions about scale and the links to policy and regulation. And I'm sort of inclined to twist the question slightly and kind of add in the sustainable finance bit, whether the policy and regulatory aspects that relate to scale and stability of the evolution of fintech, and if at all, how they might relate to the sustainable finance agenda. And Sam, I was going to start with you, partly because there is a real history to the way in which the Central Bank of Kenya kind of approached this in both enabling and shaping the emergence of M-Pesa and then M-Kopa in Kenya. So perhaps you might kick off.
Yeah, thanks. I think, yeah, regulation is very, very important in this area. I think whereas Kenya did go ahead of the pack, it was really supported by the fact that the central bank almost took like a risk in terms of allowing the telcos to run ahead even when the banks were not very ready. In fact, initially, maybe 10 years ago, when things like M-Pesa came up, the banks were all up in arms, I must admit, before we embraced the revolution. But I think there was always that hesitancy, fear, maybe of risk issues and other things. So I think, and if you look at different regulators across the world, the reason why it's not taken off in other countries, if you maybe compare two countries like Kenya and Nigeria, the regulator in Nigeria, for instance, wants it to be very bank-led. In Kenya, and some talk about differences in the way it's being approached. In Kenya, it was telco-led, and the banks embraced it and eventually followed. So I think everyone seems to be taking it differently, maybe because of different considerations around risk, and maybe it may be better for the regulators also to share the various experiences, because these have been around now for a while. We had the case of Bangladesh and bKash and what they've been able to do with bKash. So I think there are now enough case studies for people to develop some confidence or some risk mitigation tools around it. So I think it is true that regulation is very, very important, and that in Kenya we were sort of nudged as a banking sector to start embracing this new frontier. And just mentioning a little bit about Bitcoin, there was, for instance, in Kenya, a pioneer called BitPesa. And the reason it's not, despite the fact that it's been around for a while, the reason it's not really taken off has been the issue of regulation. Even citizens participating or people getting into it, so long as there has been a formal statement by regulators that this is not a recognized currency, and double with it at your own risk, or maybe at risk of being arrested, it doesn't go that far. So long as people are not clear and there is no regulatory framework to help and assist or guide people to go about it, that creates inability for people to embrace it or move into it formally. So I think regulation is very, very important in terms of making something work or giving guidance to people to be able to embrace it. So it's only when regulation is also very clear for people that they can say, I'm confident about it. If you look at Kenya, for instance, as much as talking about mobile money and just talking about a risk, in reality, they are what you call trust accounts, representing the e-value that are held by banks. So if there is not clear regulation, where should that money be? What kind of banks? How is it protected? How is the risk mitigated? If all those things are not put in place, then it can be a real problem. So I think regulation is very, very important in terms of creating those platforms and the stability required.
Thank you very much indeed. Santao, I wanted to just pick up particularly on the specific question about why you're doing Ant Forest. Okay. Yeah, kind of beyond the obvious, it would be great just to sort of tease out the balance of public interest and business, but where is that business interest in what you're doing there? Where does it really lurk?
Only this one question and a couple other questions.
Certainly pick up a couple, but if you could just sort of kick off with that one, that would be great.
Great. Regarding the Ant Forest, we have two reasons to do that. One is a political reason, one is economic reason. Political reason, China is facing huge challenge of pollution. 2/3 of air polluted, 1/3 of soil polluted, half of water polluted. So we had to think something to do that. And the top government official highly emphasize this. So as a fintech company, we have to think this is the trend for the government to promote. We have to follow that. Only in this way you can survive, you can develop. This is one. Second one is economic reason. Economically, we have to keep or expand our users gradually. You know, we have 1.3 billion population, but now we have only 450 million users. So we have some room to expand. We have many ways to do that. Payment can be approached, wealth management can be approached, but this can be another approach. Why? Because of the pollution, because of the environmental problem. And the reason we can do that, because we have a very solid user-based platform, 450 million people. So in this process, we can take advantage of individuals to give incentive for them to do. How can we give incentive? For example, I can give you some specific step. If you go to our app, you go to Ant Forest, you can check your daily life. In a daily life, there are different choices. One of the choices is how many steps you walk today. For example, you walk 10,000 steps today, you are given a certain amount of kilogram of carbon. And the carbon will be calculated to convert to a tree or part of the tree. So over a certain period, you get one tree. So this tree is only imaginary. It's only in your account. But we have another counterpart, foundation. We have another foundation in China who will purchase the tree. And the tree will be, real tree will be planted in the desert. So if I accumulate one tree, I will see my name will be put on a tree in a desert. I can follow that. So this can give me a very strong incentive for now. I'm contributing to reduction of pollution. And in the medium term, we are trying to encourage more foundation, more investor to pay the money to me. The more walk a day, the more steps I walk, I get more money. This is one example. You can get a different example. For example, you pay online, you travel, you do not drive a car to go somewhere, you bicycle, something like that. So we have a different approach to calculate that, this one. A couple questions.
2 minutes.
Okay. About the cost comparison, I can give you an example. We have a comparison of cost between the seller in China and the seller in the US in terms of payment. The per transaction cost in China in payment is 0.6% of the transaction value. In US, 3%. This is the comparison. Regarding the financial regulation, scale economy, I think a couple of issues. One, this scale economy and regulation does not necessarily related to fintech. It applies to all financial institutions. Basically, it's a safety issue. Systemically important financial institutions, traditional as well. But for fintech, we have two possible regulatory approach. One is you have to give the fintech some room to imagine, to develop, like what the UK and Singapore is doing, sandbox. Another one, you have to think in a way to classify different levels of fintech. For example, in China, there are so many peer-to-peer pressure. Half of them disappeared last year. So you have to think which one we should encourage. You have to set up some threshold for them to get in. This is second. The last point is, when you think about fintech, about scale economy, you have to think in another perspective. That is, fintech, to some extent, can reduce the risk. How? Because fintech has a huge amount of data, which is not available before. If you can take better advantage of our data, cloud computing, you can use this one to develop a robust model to monitor the risk and take a very decisive action, even daily action, to stop transaction. So this is hourly or daily transaction data can help you a lot. This is the second one. The last question regarding energy. Energy about the carbon, just now as I said, last year, Ant Financial helped save 6 million trees. We have a calculation. It's about 600,000 tons of CO2 reduction. That means we link the tree and link to the energy reduction. Beyond that, we are also providing green finance, green insurance, green funding to different SMEs. So we are also encourage these guys to produce green-friendly products. That's what we are doing. So this is the link. Yeah.
Okay. Gus, I'm happy for you to address any of the points, but because you have a sort of sweeper role, there were a couple I was particularly keen for you to pick up on. And actually one was one that you posed yourself, which is, are we really focused here on retail, or can we also look at this through an investment lens? You know, the example from Sam, which is effectively using fintech to enable crowdsourcing of a green bond, illustrates or suggests that we could think of scale. And I'd love you to speak to that, because a lot of the discussion is around large-scale investment, not only retail and behavior. And then secondly, if you do have any comments on the blockchain side, that would be very interesting.
Okay. If I may, I'll just make a quick comment about the regulatory landscape as well. I think, like in many sectors, there are certain pieces that need to be in place in the market for business to work and for funds to flow and for projects to be developed. Very simply, there's 4 or 5 categories. The first one is sort of government policy or regulation that sort of creates the umbrella and the permission for certain things to happen. The next one then is the market structure itself, how it's organized, the rules, the regulations, etc., that govern how business should happen in that particular area. The third one typically is the availability of finance. I think we all agree that that's not the issue. Money is available to invest in large projects and certainly sustainable development. And then the fourth one, particularly where it relates to technology, is the technology up to scratch. And what we're hearing from China is if you can handle 350, 400 million users and transactions in tens of thousands, it's obviously up to scratch. It works. It can be scaled. There might be a question about how much further you can scale it, but it works. And it's been designed in a way that people like it and work with it. So when we think about fintech and the rollout and the explosion of it going forward, we need to think, do we have the right ingredients in place to support that future growth? Thinking about those 4 different areas that I shared at the beginning. I think to answer the question about, do we have enough regulation and what's holding it back? We've got enough projects, we've got enough money. What I've observed over the years, particularly in relation to renewable energy, which has faced an uphill struggle in certain technology sectors as well, is it's largely around behavior and memories and risk appetite and people's awareness and acceptance and willingness to try something different. What we can observe, and it comes back to your point, Simon, about your report that you wrote, for many of the developed countries that were severely impacted by the financial crash, the memory is still sharp and distasteful in a way of what happened. And therefore a lot of behaviors are focused on making sure that doesn't happen again. But we're looking backwards, we're not looking forwards in terms of perhaps what should be in place to encourage these new developments to flourish. Countries like Kenya and others, perhaps that didn't suffer as much from the 2008 financial crash, are unencumbered by that memory perhaps and are willing to try something, a managed risk, not something that's completely sort of out of control, but you let it run in a certain way and you see what happens. And perhaps also not just the financial institutions, but the wider institutions are happier to embrace something new and run with it. The danger that we face as part of this, if regulation isn't sort of coordinated and rolled out perhaps in a unified way, and perhaps UNEP, FI has a role to play there. The Sustainable Development Goals that have come out can provide some sort of overarching framework. The danger, if there isn't something that coordinates all of this, is, as I said before, we have perhaps a lot of fintech being developed and rolled out outside of the finance sector. So you suddenly have non-traditional entrants into the field that begin to push financial services, use financial technology to address the same global challenge that's faced, which could be good, but it could also be bad. I think in terms of blockchain, just very quickly, I mean, I don't do a lot in that space, but what I've read about it and what I understand of it, it does often offer enormous potential. It begins to address some of these human issues that I've talked about, the awareness, the capability, the risk perception, the readiness to embrace something different. And if it can begin to tick some of those boxes and reassure users at an individual scale, but also at an entity and institutional level, then it can only be a good thing. Because one of the things that we struggle with in the financial system today is the lack of transparency, the illicit behavior that shouldn't be happening at the moment, the unregulated flows of money. The crowdsourcing idea, I think, has already taken off, but it needs extra help and it could be expanded hugely. In many countries around the world at the moment, I can already take, let's say, $1,000, crowdsource it, and I become part of a 100 or 200 megawatt renewable energy project. That exists today. It works, and my money is held. It may not be that liquid. I can't sell it immediately when I want to get my money back, but the mechanism for me to participate in a big project to which I would never have access to otherwise exists already. So the closing comment would be, there's lots of solutions out there at the moment. Let's think cross-industry. Let's see how other industries have perhaps tackled scaling up globalization. Think the car industry, think the airline industry, and let's borrow some lessons from that and apply that to fintech and in particular sustainable finance and development agendas. And I'm sure we can put those pieces together and achieve a much faster rate of growth than we have so far.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to turn to you, the participants, once again, just to see whether there are any other, perhaps less so, questions and more observations or comments. Curious, drawing from where you are in your work, in your institutions, whether this appears irrelevant, whether this appears kind of fascinating and interesting, but nothing really to do with what you've got to deal with, or whether some of these perspectives and changes that are being described, are going to flow through to more deep-rooted changes in the way in which you're going to do your job going forward, thinking about sustainable finance and more broadly. Yeah, so very, very keen to hear how this hits home in your own world on a Monday morning. Anyone has a Monday morning?
Sunday morning in the Middle East.
Could indeed be Sunday morning, absolutely. Any other comments or questions? Okay, then I'm going to ask one more round of very brief questions, and then draw this session to a close. We're about 5 or so minutes out. So we've touched on potential risks associated with fintech, and I think UNEP is very committed to pursuing this area, but is not taking a sort of technologically Pollyannish, overly optimistic view. So we're trying to understand the balance of challenges and unintended consequences, just as we are trying to engage and leverage the upside opportunities. We already heard the question about energy use in sort of global cloud service systems. I would be keen, really from any of you, perhaps Sintao, perhaps starting with you if you're interested, just to hear what are the risks through a sustainability lens that we need to be aware of, and perhaps how they could best be managed.
Okay. I think there are two types of risk in fintech industry to be sustainable. One is the traditional financial sector risk. Let's say credit risk, liquidity risk, market risk, reputation risk. These guys can also someday pump up in a fintech. This is a risk we have to monitor closely. The second is more challenging. It's technology, operational, and fraud risk. Technology, we know, if you, in the world, you can see many regulators, nationally and globally. For the banking, you have banking regulator in each country. In global, you have BIS. For the monetary policy, you have individual central bank, you have IMF. But for technology, you can see no global regulator. So if there is some kind of sudden shock to technology, it will be chaos. So technology risk is a very key challenge, not only for us, but for everybody. Another one is operational risk. Now, for example, take our company as an example. We have such a huge amount of data for individuals. Their cell phone, their identity card, their bank account, bank information. How can you ensure the security of this data? If we push the button wrong, right? So this kind of challenge is huge for fintech company, and fraud risk. You may suffer a sudden loss due to some mismanagement of system. So to summarize, I think the fintech company has to think the risk management from these two perspectives. And if you can successfully manage the two risks, you can be very successful. Otherwise, sooner or later, you will die. I think this is the summary of the risk.
Fantastic. Sam, Gus, please. Yeah.
Just to add one other one, which I think sits nicely along the two that you've mentioned, is around behavior. So if I equip individuals with fantastic technology and access through fintech to endless opportunities, my behavior might change as well. And we spoke earlier, Simon, about the holding period of shares. So in the old days, you would hold them for months, years, decades, perhaps. If you look at the frequency of share trading on stock exchanges these days, in many cases they're held for seconds or minutes, and the greatest volume of shares are only held very briefly to take advantage of a small margin. On one hand, okay, this is profit maximization, and it's what private sector is about. On the other hand, in terms of sustainable finance and reaching some of our development objectives, it's exactly the wrong thing that you want, the constant churn. What you need is more of the continuity, the long-term view, staying with something rather than churning things as often as possible just to maximize the short-term return. So I think we'll see some new behaviors possibly emerging as a result of fintech being available And that may distort the outcomes that we were hoping to achieve by the very development of the fintech platform in the first place.
And this has come up a number of times. On the one hand, we look at fintech as enabling because it's faster, because it's cheaper, because it allows citizens to get closer to the financial decision. It disintermediates perhaps financial institutions that have become lazy or slower or significant rent takers. All of those things seem positive. It allows mobilization of savings in ways that don't have to go through mainstream incumbent institutions. But if I compare it to the conversation we just had under the previous session with, for example, the gentleman from Hermes, that was all about patient capital. That was all about long-term perspectives. And of course, fintech has little, if anything, to do with that. Just a few days ago, the Bundesbank issued a report on high-frequency trading in Germany, and to some extent reflecting experience across Europe. Their conclusions: some high-speed trading, is kind of good for the market and increases liquidity where it's needed in certain areas. Other types of high-speed trading are very problematic for the market, removes liquidity at critical junctures in financial decision-making, increases volatility, reduces the certainty of long-term investors to put their money into the market. So certainly the area, Gus, you're highlighting really kind of teases out a sort of fundamental question about the kind of speed agenda and how that can be supportive, set against this kind of patient capital view that many of us kind of think about sustainable finance in terms of. Sam, I'm going to come to you last before I draw a couple of concluding comments. Kind of risks and issues that have come through in Kenya or elsewhere that you've seen that we should be aware of in the fintech against sort of sustainable finance area?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some significant risks. I mean, if you have a system where maybe 60% of GDP is going through, if anything were to happen to that system, you're carrying a big kind of systemic risk. So thinking about what the fallbacks should be, how to respond to it, and the thing is, just last week we saw a huge attack on something as, in North America, in the internet and in Europe, and these are very advanced places in terms of technologically. So being aware of this fundamental risk to a system that's dependent on technology is something that's very, very important. So the amount of resilience you need to build is very, very significant. And just that, if you can't give people the confidence, a high degree of confidence that this system will be there, it'll continue to serve them, it is secure, you definitely are carrying a huge problem. I think if you look at, and one thing about technology, and it touches a bit on, he mentioned, the gentleman from LSE talked about issues around even sustainability itself. If you look at technology, we say we are replacing paper, like we were trying, and this is something we are trying to study. We say we've eliminated so many trips to the bank, so much carbon emissions, so much this. We're no longer using the paper. We're now sending you, we don't want you to print anything at the ATM. But we're also creating something else. You're creating hot server rooms. You're having e-waste, for instance, because people are changing their tablets so fast. So it's not something that's, it's a new area. It's not something we've studied in detail. So there was a bit of, people are a bit quick to bank the so-called benefits, but I think assessing and analyzing, and I must admit it's an area we're trying to look at, because in terms of that continuity, and the thing is what's happening, we've just done a major upgrade of our systems across the bank. But these days you need to upgrade much more than you used to do in the past. Technology is going so fast that to create the resilience and to upgrade these systems takes a lot more. So there is another inherent risk that's coming out of the reliance, the heavy reliance of technology. And to make it worse, we've even been having another side product, and this is social media, where somebody can go into social media and even send information that's not accurate. I said I go to social media to follow a lot of my news, but sometimes there's also misinformation in there, and it can be misinformation about technology. There are people, for instance, if you look at the Kenyan scenario, one of the things, and I was dealing with a case like this even when I was here, is where people send messages mimicking messages that have to do with money transfer, purporting to be from KCB, purporting maybe to be from M-Pesa, etc. saying you've received this money or stuff like that, scams. But before, when somebody had to go to the banking hall, it was very difficult. But now people are used to seeing a message on their phone as actually a transaction. So what's happening, and for one of the things, in fact, I was trying to drive just before the convention started, is that if such a message comes from a mobile phone company, they should be held liable, because every single mobile phone number should be registered. So if there's a scammer who's sitting somewhere within your system that is unregistered or undeclared, then you need to be liable. So there are other risks that are emanating of this nature, but I think a much better study needs to be done about, are we creating, as we feel we are progressing, there is some emissions coming out, and I must admit that we are still in the nascent stages of studying the true impact. I think part of it we are learning as we go along. You can't quite anticipate everything, but as these things emerge, then you need to keep on studying them and understanding how you can manage and keep on reinventing yourself.
Great. So I think my takeout from all of these comments is, we're scratching the surface. This is the beginning. And of course, Sam, you calling for studies is always music to my ears. Let me just try and draw three, just three strands out of this very briefly as we bring this session to a close. I think UNEP was right in seeing the importance of going much more deeply into this area in understanding the future trajectory of sustainable finance. We've actually touched on very small subsets of fintech, not actually the full space at all. We haven't really talked at all about the linkages between fintech and artificial intelligence and the linkages between those two and the Internet of Things. And it's this actually technological ecology that really will mark the transformation of the relationship between the financial system and the real economy in many, many different ways. And so if I was kind of calling one piece out to ourselves as UNEP and to you as members and participants and supporters of the work in which we do, this is an area that shouldn't be limited to an interesting, hopefully, session here at the GRT, but should be extended into some of the work that we're doing with you going forward. Secondly, drawing particularly from the examples from Kenya and China, if we understand developing countries, at least in one characterization, as being dominated by banking and having relatively weak capital markets that are needed in our minds to deliver the long-term infrastructure investment linked to sustainable development, one of the key questions is, does this give us a leapfrogging opportunity? We understand leapfrogging when we've looked at cell phones themselves in relation to landlines, but can we really envisage, and this was some of the comments you made, Gus, can we envisage fintech beginning to give us some shortcuts to ways in which domestic savings in developing countries can be mobilized more effectively for domestic sustainable investment? Stripping out some of the barriers to cross-border investment that we all know and love and have talked about many times. We haven't really talked about SMEs. If we'd had time, we would have got into it. Clearly, this is a potential game changer for the way in which SME lending takes place, because it massively reduces search costs. And it begins to allow green and SMEs to be connected within the financing environment, something that was really not conceivable beforehand. And finally, really picking up on the key message from the plenary beforehand, from Rachel and others, which is, we get it in the room, but we need to be ambitious. Where are the institutions that are going to take this to scale? It seems to me that part of the scale answer is that it will either come through some of the deeper changes in the business models of the institutions that are in the room, or the effects of the emergence of, whether it be M-Pesa or Ant or other new business models that are coming into the financial sector at scale. Gentlemen, I found the session really fantastic. Thank you very much for your your contribution. Great questions, great comments. Please join me in thanking the panel.